recording it.
I think if you get to quality speakers such as yourselves, it would be a shame not to record what was going on for future generations. I think they'll be still watching this one in 50 years' time. So,
50
I did ask for permission to do that, didn't I?
Our fee goes up if it's for repeat. You get extra fees.
So from right. So this room will just take a little bit of time to populate, gentlemen. So just bear with me. Flooding in as we speak. And I must say how much I love the church windows in the background. It's a nice touch.
Except it's a school.
Well, it is a school attached to a church, though.
Yes, built in 1853 and moved.
So that was before you were born, or was that before you were born or after?
Yes, I'm not sure. I don't really remember. I was very young then.
Very good. Well, before we do our welcomes, this room is just filling up slowly but surely, so we'll just continue to let that happen organically. Welcome to everyone that is sitting out there at the moment in webinar land. I can give you the weather report down here in Hobart. It's cold. I know that surprises a lot of you.
Beautiful day in Melbourne as well.
It was sunny today.
Hello, Kelly. Malaysia. That's a long way. That's great. If anyone else wants to pop in the chat where they're listening in from, that'd be lovely just to hear where our audience is at while we wait for this room to fill up. Yeah, hello, Perth. Melbourne. Brizzy, that's typical of Brisbane. Can't even say the full name, have to use the abbreviation. Lovely. More from Perth. They're coming in too quickly. I can't keep up. There's a Wollongong there. Welcome, Andrew. Coffs Harbour, lovely to have you along. Right, that seems to be slowing up a little bit now, guys. And Berlin, I think that takes the cake for the furthest away from Hobart. Welcome, Annette. Lake Mac in New South Wales as well. Right, I think that is slowing there. So thank you everyone for your patience. Welcome along to your Light Rights webinar. My name's Landon, I'm on the board of ADSA, and we are very privileged today to be joined by our two guest speakers, special guests we will call them. And by way of introduction, I will just run through their bios quickly if you will allow me the privilege, and we'll go with age before beauty, if we may. So our first guest speaker is David Bird. Now David's been a lighting designer for almost 35 years. In 2010, he co-founded 2B Design to focus on projects that required a more creative and sensitive approach to design. David is the chair of the International Association of Lighting Designers, Energy, Sustainability and Quality Committee. It's a mouthful, David, but I'm sure that's abbreviated down to some acronyms somewhere. But one of the committee's focuses is to assess better approach to lighting design that creates more comfortably lit spaces, yet is sustainable and mindful of the impact on the environment. So David makes a perfect speaker when we read words like that. He's passionate about education, either in former role as he has had at RMIT or VUT, and also in ad hoc events. He believes that the society needs a better understanding of the impact of life on our well-being and our nighttime environment. And as a former student of David's, I will actually also add a very patient man. He had to be. Welcome, David. And Jackson, welcome to you also. So Jackson is the founding director of A Billion Suns, a design practice that uses light to create outstanding visual experiences for architecture and the urban environment. Its goal is to create a better visual world through improving lifestyle whilst respecting biodiversity and the environment. The practice conducts research to understand key lighting issues that need to be addressed, as well as highlighting design opportunities for future development that will better the nighttime environment we live in. And I think if we're lucky tonight, we might hear a little bit about some of that research and projects that Jackson's working on. So welcome, Jackson.
Thank you, Landon.
Now, the last thing that I must do, because the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance is a volunteer organisation and we simply don't exist without supportive members and sponsors. And in tonight's case, we are very fortunate to have a sponsor in Bucket Illumination Group lending their support to this. As I say, just the costs of webinar fees alone is an impact on us and what we can do. So Buckford Illumination Group have kindly offered to put their money where their mouth is tonight. Now, Buckford is a distributor of high-quality European and Australian-made light products in Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia and Tasmania. And they also represent many of our ADSA-approved lighting fixtures that you'll find on our website. Now, personally, I've known the guys at Buckford for a long time and I will commend their commitment to sustainability. But more importantly, I know that they go out of their way to educate on the issues of light pollution. And I think that's really important that manufacturers and distributors are also getting behind this story because it has to come from every angle if we're going to solve the issue of light pollution. So we thank them very, very much for getting behind tonight's webinar and thank you to all their team that are also in attendance, as I can see. So without further ado, we are going to hand over to David and Jackson, who I think only fairly will give you a little bit of a background in what it is that they actually do as lighting designers. So I will hand over to you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Landon.
Thanks, Landon. It's great to be able to do this because we're very passionate about light, and it's good to run a session like this, which is informative and providing real information to everyone.
One of the questions that I was chatting with Landon about is, what is a lighting designer?
Well, a lighting designer is someone that works specifically with light. As you will be aware of, but light is actually invisible. It's not something that people think about a lot. However, our visual senses, our eyes, are stimulated with how light interacts with these surfaces from which it is reflected. So light makes surfaces or objects radiate their color and texture. So therefore, it's very important as a lighting designer that we work with other designers and people that create buildings and spaces to understand the surfaces and textures within there. So the whole thing is actually an experience. The second part of who we work with that's also important, and the most important, are our clients and the users and the occupants of spaces. So we have to understand how they're going to use these spaces, what time of day, what's the functionality, if it needs task lighting, if it doesn't. So they're all things that we need to collaborate with.
To follow on from that, you can't create, well, good lighting design is a bubble. I mean, you've only got to look at the bubble in Canberra and do we get good government? Good lighting outcome means successful collaboration with all the parties concerned. There are 3 points that I stress when I'm teaching the subject and to my clients: less is better, value darkness, and remember, contrast is the key. Having light and shade is really important. It's good, not bad. And what I would do is start with darkness, add little by little to create the right overall ambience, and then and only then add additional task lighting if it's really needed. Remember, light is life. We can't live without light. We think using light. We dream using light. Light impacts on our emotions. And light affects biodiversity.
And I think one of the major reasons that we're all here tonight is because we're all becoming more aware of how much light is within our spaces and our cities. And this is a little graphic that represents this. Essentially, this was taken in 2010, and it shows the amount of light radiating from this area in Victoria, which is basically Melbourne and the peninsula. And the red core is like high intensity, and then you can see it sort of tapers off as it gets away from that. And this image was taken in 2020. So you can see just in 10 years how much extra light pollution our city is producing. And this is not just our city, this is pretty much for most cities within Australia. So this session is really targeted about how this is affecting us and what we can do about it. Back to you, Landon.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate that. Now, we have been canvassing our audience for many weeks now to send in their questions. And so, and in full disclosure, I have actually revealed these questions in advance to David and Jackson. So we're just going to go through some of those questions now, and then afterwards we'll actually give you guys the opportunity to ask some questions. I'll ask you at any time that anything that comes to your head that you'd like to know, if you could just please use the Q&A down the bottom of your screen to do that, and I'll keep an eye on that, or I'll also keep an eye on the chat. So please feel free to just write your questions as we go. But the first question that we selected out of the many that we received is that I've heard about the Australian and New Zealand standard AS 4282, and could you explain, guys, what that is?
AS 4282, Australian Standards number 4282, deals with light pollution. It's in fact the control of obtrusive effects of outdoor lighting. Lighting could be spill light from neighbours' tennis courts or glare from distant objects like a sports field or growing now illuminated signage. There are maximum levels of permitted light pollution that can enter your home. Has to be a habitable room like a bedroom or a kitchen, not a storeroom. And from other installations. It can be from a security system. It could be nearby tennis courts. And the other element is brightness or glare, which again can be from a spotlight from a sports facility or brightness from the now increasingly prevalent TV screens that are on the sides of buildings. If we look at the chart here on the left, it gives you a breakup within the standards from different zones within the community. AO is in fact a UNESCO, we don't want any light, down to the bottom of A4, which is in a CBD environment. So the further away from the city you are, the less light you're permitted, and the curfew levels are dramatically less than the normal levels, and the curfew clocks in at 11 o'clock and finishes at dawn.
Then we have threshold increment, which deals with how bright or glare a source is with regards to how dark a background is, which is a little bit more technical, so we won't go into too much detail with that. But we also here have a new column, which was only added in 2019, which talks about how much sky glow is permitted, which is the amount of light spilling up from a fitting itself. So in the scenario on the right here, this is, say, a habitable room here. So there is a maximum amount during a curfew period of light that can fall onto that surface. Back to you, Landon.
Thanks, guys. And I should point out there was obviously very Australian-centric for our international guests tonight that are listening in, but there will be plenty of questions that are global. Having said that, the next one is actually, again, a local question, and that is, are there any other standards, policies or procedures around reducing light trespass that we should know about?
And the answer is yes. AS 1158 is a roadway and public space lighting code, and it deals with highways, minor roads and shared pedestrian and vehicle areas such as promenades, open spaces.
City squares, walkways, all those kind of things. And it sort of outlines the amount of illumination you need on the ground, but also importantly, it outlines how much illumination we need on vertical surfaces so you can see other people within that space.
So the car can see you before it hits you.
Correct.
Vic roads also have standards to do with illuminated signage and the distraction that they may cause for motorists and pedestrians.
And recently released with the National Light Pollution Guidelines for Wildlife, which is a really interesting document, which essentially outlines good practices for lighting and how it affects biodiversity and other creatures that live with us, and how to reduce those effects.
And many cities and councils do have a public lighting strategies, and they provide a holistic overview of how the city or the council area should be lit.
Correct. And we've shown an image of the one on the right, which is Melbourne's. Other cities do have them, and all the smaller municipalities do also. And these documents, are quite good. They sort of outline the vision for the city in terms of how they want to light the city in the future, and some good practices that if you are looking to light buildings within the city, how to do that best. Ooh. Back to you, Landon.
All right, thanks again, gentlemen. I almost loathe to ask this next one because one of my responsibilities as ADSA is looking after ADSA approved. But the question is, I came across a website claiming to sell dark sky friendly lights. How can I be sure that this is indeed correct?
Well, my answer to that is very simple. There's no such thing as a dark sky friendly light fitting. What is important is not so much the light fitting, but the installation. The intent of the dark sky friendly light fittings, and this in essence applies to complying with AS 1158 for the lighting of roads and pathways and parks, etc., is when it's mounted in its horizontal position, that it has no or minimal upward sky glow.
Correct. So, a lot of manufacturers have taken steps recently to sort of, when the fittings are positioned properly, aiming downwards, that, no light pollution is actually being pushed up out of the fitting, and that's a requirement. So 2 images that demonstrate this is like the image on the left you can see here is a city that has a lot of upward projected light. So what we want to try and achieve is similar to the image on the right, in terms of we're lighting what we need to light the roadway here, but we're not spilling light into the nature strip behind it. And we can still create these light and dark spaces in our cities because we now have good light sources that can be controlled very well. And this is an important way to design.
And going back to a comment I made a few minutes ago, less is better. Landon, over to you.
Very good, very good. I will point out, because we do have a dark sky sensitive fixture program at ADSA. Our view is very much the same. The light fitting is a small part of the equation. So whilst we can assess it, and I will say not all light fittings are created equal, we assess it against things like glare, its ability to dim, which makes it responsive to human use, and things like the upward waste light from that fitting. It still does come down to actually using those luminaires in the best case. So thank you for that answer, guys.
If I can chime in just for a second. Glare is one of the big issues with outdoor lighting. To make the place feel safe and comfortable, people need to be able to move around safely. And if you have a light fitting which is shining in your eyes, you won't be able to see clearly, and it's highly likely that it will be polluting the environment as well. So the correct light fitting is absolutely crucial to getting a well-lit space.
And one other thing is also materiality. Is a lot of people don't talk about how much light's coming off a surface. So if you have a light surface with a lot of light on it, then you're still going to get a lot of light pollution out of that. So we need to be considering the color of surfaces in external places as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks, Jackson. Now, we to be honest, we get questions very regularly, and this one, I think we've probably had about 20 different times in variations, but outside my house is a street light that has recently been upgraded to a more high intensity luminaire. My attempts to get this rectified have been unsuccessful, assuming, I guess, that they've contacted their local council. Is there anything I can do?
There should be. I've found where you have conflict between neighbours, where maybe it's a tennis court light that's lighting your bedroom, initial friendly contact. If the relationship between the two parties tends to sour, then the next step would be to get a qualified lighting professional to measure the amount of pollution. So rather than, I think it's too bright, no, it's not, yes, it is, no, it's not, you've got some evidence that the lighting is in fact non-compliant, at which point you can take it to the council, or if all else fails, you take legal action.
And obviously that's like the final action. But essentially, the whole point of this presentation tonight is to make you aware of the standards that are available, that do actually give you something to go back with. So you can make them aware that you're aware of these standards and there is maximum amount of light that is allowed into your habitable spaces, and you think it might exceed that. So the first step is to tell people that you're aware of this, and that you know, if it continues and you think that it's going to exceed that, then you can take steps beyond that.
And it may well be that the offending owner of the light fitting is not aware that what he's doing is illegal. And I think if it starts with a friendly chat over a wine or two, and then gets more and more nasty as it goes on.
We've had Ben Dixon's just asked the question, and I guess it's what if it's a street light, not a private light? But is it a different response between, say, a public asset and a private asset that you would have?
Well, if it's a public asset, you can go to the owner of the public asset, whether that could be the council or the supply authority, and they will be well aware of the legal status. If it's a neighbour, they probably are not, and that may require a more gentle approach. But if it's a street light's been upgraded and it's causing you havoc, then the supply authority ought to be able to rectify it fairly quickly.
Yeah. And a lot of councils that we're aware of are having difficulty with this issue, because a lot of buildings are being built next to pre-existing residential scenarios, and they have residents in there complaining about the new building. So they're constantly in negotiations with new building owners with regards to what they need to do in terms of dimming down signs or dimming down installations on their buildings in order to meet the requirements of residents. So most of these councils and associations are aware of it, and they do have processes in which they can rectify it as well, which does involve practitioners as well, quite often.
All right. We'll probably stay on this question for a bit longer, because there's a lot in the chats that are fairly relevant to this. And if I can go back and find the question we had earlier here from Chris Ryan, if we can jump back up and see if we can't locate it. But essentially the question was, you know, how do we measure? And I raise this because I noticed you mentioned, David, get a lighting designer to measure lighting to see if it doesn't comply. But is there anything that a resident can do before they have to go to that step?
A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. You can buy illuminance apps for your iPhone, which will give you a rough indication of what the illuminance level is in your at the window.
However, they're typically better at higher illuminances, and once you get, so the Australian standards, once you get below 10 lux, these devices aren't good at the low requirements, and because it's so precise, it's not great for that. You can buy an illuminance meter, like a proper device, but that will cost you $500 upwards. Yeah, it's a difficult one because it's such a low level of light.
I think a lighting practitioner will give you a fairly quick response. It could be quite informal, so you're not engaging someone for 4 days to write a report. And certainly if it's the council, and my experience with council is if someone complains, they will send someone to site to confirm whether this is a real problem or just a whingy resident.
Correct. And I suppose the other key thing is to document it well. So like this image demonstrates, like take a good image of what's happening at night, and explain what, you know, what that room is there, that might be your bedroom. Explain that, you know, it's a habitable space, and just take them through the steps so that they're aware of the full situation. They can understand the situation, which will be more likely that they'll send someone to assist.
A picture's worth 1,000 words. I could say there's 20 lux at the window. What does that look like? But looking at this picture, gee, that looks bright. I think there might be a problem.
So there is, and we have one here from Monique, who's been, you know, street lighting rep from Central Coast, and it seems that the council's hands are tied during to the lighting guidance. And I've had one recently in Tasmania where the council is not the lighting guidance that's tied their hands. It's actually the local power authority who have basically said that there's nothing that can be done about a light that's spilling into someone's residence. So from a council point of view and where they sit in the scheme of things, specifically the street lighting, can we elaborate on that issue?
Well, if there's a problem with spill light coming off the back of the street light fitting, it is possible to put a guard behind it, a baffle, to stop it spilling into the house. And certainly here in Melbourne, I'm aware of a number of sites where this has been a problem, and the council, or in this case, the supply authority, rectified it. I certainly noticed the change from fluorescent street lighting to LED street lighting in itself is creating issues. Whilst there may be minimal sky glow from the new LED fittings, there are a lot more glare coming from them. And if it's on a high pole and you're in a ground floor room, you may well find that there's unacceptable levels of light and glare coming into the room.
And if it has been replaced recently, then in order to replace it, there would have to been lighting calculations done for each scenario. So essentially they create a 3D model, they put all the light fittings in there, and they render how much light they're going to get on the roadways and then the surrounding areas. And as part of that process, then you need to put habitable spaces into that calculation and make sure that the spill light coming from those road fittings doesn't exceed the maximum levels of the Australian standards. And that's what the standard's for. So if it has been updated recently and doesn't meet the criteria, then the responsibility falls to the person that's approved the design or done the design.
I suspect in many instances where it's a one-for-one swap, minimal calculations are done, and we'll do this, and then if someone complains, we'll come back and maybe do something to rectify it.
I was actually about to suggest, I thought Jackson was being very generous there to assume that designs were being done with some of these roadways, but one thing I do know too with power authorities and road lighting, particularly P category, which is anything with like a shared public space or anything with a footpath, they actually don't need to comply to obtrusive light unless it's requested of them. Some of the onus actually does fall onto the councils initially when they're asking for a street light rollout or a street lighting upgrade, that design should be compliant to AS 4282, because unless it's requested and it's specifically written that way in the standard, then it's not a requirement. So it's just, if anyone is part of a council out there, please make sure that is part of your brief.
Yeah, agreed. And that's, yeah, we've done work recently in assisting councils in basically writing what documents they need to include in their approval processes for new buildings and new installations, because then if something is an issue, they can push it back on the person that actually has built or constructed or developed that space. Yeah,
and that's very much a municipality by municipality arrangement.
Yeah.
I think we're starting to flow beautifully into our next question for you guys, and there has been some similar questions in the chats. And this question is, I live in a strata building and have lights that are on all night, keeping me awake. What is the best way to rectify this?
Joy of joys. Starting with diplomacy, ascertaining who owns the light that's annoying you and seeing if it can either be dimmed or turned off at 11 o'clock at night. And if a friendly chat doesn't get clarification on it, you're almost back into the same problem we were talking about with the street light of taking legal action. If it's a corridor light or an access light that's on 24 hours a day, all night, motion detector can turn it off unless there's someone there. Could work. There are many ways you can minimise lighting spaces that are unoccupied.
This is it's a good question, because I mean, a lot of light pollution that goes back to the images we showed before of 2010 and 2020 is from building lights like this car park here that's on all night, and it's actually, you know, producing light pollution into the environment
and wasting energy.
Correct.
So motion detectors can work well on buildings, but in open areas where there may be a problem, there is a tendency for any motion to be detected, such as a fox or a possum running through the place, and so the lights get turned on unnecessarily. But certainly within a building, motion detectors would be a good way of turning the lights off if there's no one there, but turning them on if someone does come.
And often retrofitting scenarios that don't have overly complicated control systems or anything. Well, if they had a control system, they can reprogram that. But a lot of these buildings just don't have control attached to these light fittings. So in order to retrofit it, it isn't often like a overly costly thing. However, if there are quite a few residents that are concerned by it, then I'd put it back to the body corporate, and you'd probably be surprised with the cost associated in terms of putting a daylight detection system in there or a time of day operation system that can just turn them off after dark.
Beautiful. Thank you. Well, guys, that sort of concludes the formal questions. Now you're flying solo. These are the questions that you haven't been prepared for, but I'm sure your combined experience will handle this next session beautifully. And I want to actually touch on a question here from John Taylor, because I know, Jackson, you and I have had many discussions on this topic. I know that you're quite involved in this area. And John's asked, I've seen a very bright TV from the Glen Shopping Centre in Victoria, from Mount Dandenong. It must be hellish to live near. Is there an easy way to check if this is pre-standards or regulations?
Easy way. Well, it's a really emerging area of concern for councils and for cities, and they're doing lots of work to rectify them. Essentially, there's no easy way to measure it. However, with the standards that are involved right now, like there's if it's near a roadway, there are lots of standards from the local municipality and also VicRoads and things like this, which stipulate the maximum brightness of this sign throughout the different times of day. And it has to dim from daylight to nighttime operation. And the maximum surface brightness of these signs is also stipulated. So to get approval for these signs, you need to basically provide it with a plan of how it's going to meet these requirements through operation. And these plans are usually done by lighting practitioners or engineering consultants. So if there is a screen that you think is not compliant, then I would ask for these compliance documents in terms of, we usually call it like a, what is it? It's a lighting assessment of it, or a lighting strategy towards how this sign is operating throughout the day. That would be my first step. But it is the image that we used earlier in the presentation, back on this slide here. The middle image there was actually sent to me by someone saying, do you think the sign's too bright? And there's actually a nature strip that sits opposite this, and my immediate response was yes. But yeah, a lot of these signs are just operating at full intensity, and they're not being dimmed to what they should be dimmed. But it is the responsibility of the operator of the sign to comply with the standards. So I would ask for them in terms of documentation and showing how they are compliant. that
Thank
doesn't make sense.
I'm going to go back to the first question we received, Mitch G. What impact do LED lights have on light pollution?
Well, whether they're LEDs, fluorescent or metal halide, they all have the potential to create light pollution. One of the good things about LEDs are that they're tiny. And those who are familiar with the laws of physics will understand that a point source is much easier to control than a large surface area light source, such as a T5 fluorescent. Therefore, luminaire manufacturers can now make light fittings that are very controllable, so you can almost guarantee, provided they're installed properly, that you don't get light pissing up into the heavens when it should be focused on something at pedestrian level.
Yeah, I mean, and also to add to LED is it's highly controllable, so it can be dimmed and changed throughout the course of the day or through motion detection. With a lot of historical light sources, they were difficult to switch on and off and dim. So yeah, there's a lot of possibility with LED in terms of we can create a world that actually has less light and has light where we need it when we want it, and LED enables us to do that. However, the problem with LED is it's also become highly accessible and cheap. So we're actually seeing an increase in lighting everywhere because it's become so available. So it's kind of this duality, is that we can potentially solve it, but at the moment we need to educate people and we need to take steps in order to work towards that solution.
One of the other good things about LEDs, the fact that they're dimmable, and unlike architecture or interior design, lighting can change during the course of the day. And certainly at night, you may want a relatively high light level if pedestrian and vehicular traffic is high, but at 2 in the morning, if there's no one there, the lights can be dimmed down and only activated if there's it detects a lot of activity.
Very good. I will also point out, I think if you jump onto our Australasian Dark Sky Alliance website, there was a very good article published by the IES NA a few weeks back, and we have a link on our, if you look under best practice lighting guidelines about light pollution and spectral content with LEDs. It's quite interesting to look at that just on a one-for-one basis, taking away from all the other aforementioned things that you gentlemen have just raised.
Yeah, I suppose we could touch on that, Landon, in terms of with LEDs, you can also tune the color of the light within the white spectrum. So you can take out, because the light spectrum is made up of a full spectrum color, we can actually take out bandwidths. And we now know through the research that's been developed over the last 20 years, is most animals, biodiversity, wildlife, and humans are more affected towards the higher intensity light, which is in the blue, ultraviolet, the high intensity spectrum. So we actually have the ability to change with LED, move to a warmer spectrum, to the red spectrum, which has less effect on human beings and biodiversity at night. However, that's a whole another array.
Well, further to that, Dave Fisher's asked, is there rules on the frequency of the lighting or the Kelvin temperature?
There are guidelines. The frequency, I'm not aware of whether there are any rules that stipulate what frequency you can use. Certainly with fluorescence and metal halide, the relatively low frequency flicker was a real problem for many people, but now it's less of a problem. Color temperature, I'm not aware that there are laws that stipulate it. Some of the guidelines that get issued by councils will say for high activity areas like major highways, you probably light it at 4,000 K, but when you get to domestic and small roadways, you would light them at a lower color temperature.
And this is something that's only really started to be integrated recently in terms of guidelines, but that's sort of how they become mandatory. So you'll see a step towards, okay, then to reduce the effects on biodiversity and humans, then we should move to a warmer spectrum at night. So it gets ingrained as a guideline. But actually in terms of regulation, yeah, we're working on something at the moment with the City of Melbourne, which is looking to tune the colour temperature after dark for advertising. So that's one step. So similar that your phone or your computer changes at night, we're trying to get that within the city environment as well with digital screens and things to take out that blue content that we just talked about. However, it's not yet mandatory.
Thank you. I wanted to go to this question here just because it's actually a little bit contradictory of something that was just said. So Ben Dixon, my area of Sydney, a lot of old street lighting fittings replaced with LED fittings that have a wider spill attached to existing poles. So the result is the light spill now hits much higher on the surrounding buildings. Seems to be no planning or testing other than contractor replacing existing fittings. And you just mentioned that one of the advantages of LED was its control. So is there a reason we're seeing this happen where it seems like the opposite of what you've just said?
Yes, there is. Simple, cost. This fitting, hey, it's cheaper than the others. Light pieces everywhere. Let's do it. Or ignorance on the part of people specifying until the contract's been awarded and the light fittings may be less appropriate. Certainly when I was at the Lighting Council Awards dinner a couple of years ago, walking around the CBD in Sydney, which the areas I was in was all LED lit, I in fact thought this is really gloomy because there was no spill light on the adjacent buildings and it really felt uncomfortable.
Yeah, so that's the other, creating spaces with just lighting and then not lighting can often make you feel unsafe. So you do need a little bit of spill lighting, but controlling that spill lighting in terms of make sure it doesn't exceed what is regulated and what is not.
If you pick a leaf out of the City of Melbourne's book, when they relit King Street 20 years ago, they had two light sources, one at 8 metres to light the roadway and one at 5 metres to light the footpath. So that holistically, it was a well-lit space. There was a lot less light on the footpath and maybe up to about 3 metres on the building, whereas the roadway was properly lit. Now, I understand that they're extending that philosophy to a lot of the other streets, but councils with less finances may find that's to get better quality lighting is outside their financial scope.
Which is a really difficult issue because the main issue that I've become aware of with councils is they're not concerned about how the light performs or where it goes. They're only concerned with how much electricity reduction they're going to get and their savings for the actual council. So, and a lot of councils can't afford to do everything, but they're trying to do as much as they can to save energy. So it's this difficult sort of juggle is that they're trying to do as much as they can, but often they're not putting in the fitting which provides the best outcome for that.
I would suggest to anyone who's involved in supplying streetlight luminaires and working with councils, do a mock-up. Certainly the Fed Square, which opened in 2005, I think, that was mocked up in a laneway to make sure that the catenary lighting did what it was purported to do. And if you're putting in upgrading your street lighting, put in half a dozen fittings, see how they perform. And again, the City of Melbourne did a roadway in the back of South Bank where they had 6 different LED streetlight luminaires. And they assessed them for lighting quality and for glare and for control. And then they made their selection. So it cost relatively small sum of money to do a mock-up, and it can save a major cock-up if in fact you pick the wrong one.
Which I think a lot of city councils are doing. I know Brisbane City Council does it a lot as well. They'll actually mock up a whole street with different colour temperature light sources and then ask the residents to provide their feedback on what the preference is. So yeah, there are steps being taken, but this is happening so quickly that it's really difficult to do it well everywhere.
Yeah, it's a very positive when a council does that. We have had feedback again through ADSA from councils doing that and then ignoring the constituents' advice, which is disappointing. But I think it is really important that community feedback is engaged. I've got just one other thing to add to that, and this is just from my own experience in my street, is that LEDs are designed by the very nature to be mounted at horizontal, and the old street lighting discharge lamps were on 10, 15 degree tilts, and the council doesn't seem to, and the power authorities don't seem to understand that LEDs stack up at 15 degrees as an incredibly glary light source, and so, and such a simple thing to rectify, just to tilt the light fitting down, you know, that 10, 15 degrees to create a much more pleasant environment, and very rarely done.
Yeah, installation's a huge part of it. That's a really good point. It's like a lot of things, the design intention can be there, but then when you go back and actually look at how it's been installed, there's issues with installation. So it's about doing it well a whole way along the journey.
Very good. Now, this is a very topical one for me, and I actually read shall we say, an advertisement for another webinar today on a social page that said darkness is problematic for crime, and come and listen to our webinar on how to, you know, light outdoor spaces. And I've never considered darkness to be a problem for crime. I've considered too much contrast a problem for crime. But the question here is from Gail Holt, and just exactly that. People arguing that lighting an area all night reduces crime. Is this backed up by facts and studies?
Well, darkness certainly allows people in black hoods to go around and getting up to mischief. But I think if you're lighting the vertical surfaces in a space, and if there are any little alcoves that people can hide in, they should be lit gently. But we're not talking about street light level lighting, but lighting to moonlight standard, so that you can see if there's someone there. I could put you onto the MCG with the sports lighting on and get 1500 lux vertical all over you and no stand lighting on, and you'll feel very uncomfortable because your horizon is black. Turn the sports lighting off and turn the stand lighting on, and you've probably got moonlight level on you, and you'll feel safe because you can see your surroundings. So in areas that are potential crime issues, light them so A, the surveillance cameras can work, and B, so you can see if there's someone lurking.
I think a lot of these presentations about this sort of darkness it's to do with what you said, Len, and its contrast. It's a lot of spaces within our urban environment will have light source in one place, like at a bus shelter, but nothing else around it. So you're moving from a really intensely lit space to something that's dark. And what we're seeing is that instead of doing that, we just need to light spaces delicately, like as a journey, because then people aren't moving from dark to light spaces, and that's when they feel uncomfortable and unsafe.
There have been issues here in Melbourne where young girls have been molested walking through a park at night. Now, if the park is not lit, there's no way on earth I'd try and walk through it. But if it's appropriately lit so that you can see the areas around you, then, but it's not brightly lit.
I think we all know that, and any time an unfortunate incident like that occurs, the first thing we see on the news the next day is a councillor putting their hand up saying we're going to put in more light. And I think as lighting professionals, you know that that's not the right answer. I'll add one more thing to this idea of light and crime, or two actually. And the first one is, I think the Australian standards probably gives us a really good indication, because the 2020 edition of public lighting had a really interesting change where the words used to be, one of the criteria was designed around risk of crime. And that's now changed and been removed. It's now fear of crime. And the standard actually acknowledged that the evidence around lighting reducing crime is basically non-existent. But the evidence around the perception of safety is actually, I guess, still open for debate. And the other one to point out is what's been going on in the UK, that have actually been turning out their streetlights entirely after midnight in some municipalities. And of course, the argument there was that that was going to increase traffic accidents and increase crime. And this has been going on for some time now. I think over 18 months now, and the initial evidence is actually the opposite, that the crime, if anything, has gone down, and accidents, if anything, have gone down. So I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, a number of councils I've worked with, if you're going to light the park, light it properly, or don't light it at all, because it's certainly not an invitation to walk through if it's dark. But if there's an odd light, oh, I'm supposed to use this. So I'm not surprised that turning lights off at night wouldn't have an adverse effect. It used to be common in the UK when I was a lad that in a well-lit city, you only drove with your parking lights on. And I commend it, because the contrast between your headlights and the surroundings is really quite high. But if you've just got parking lights on, your vehicle can be seen, and you can see in much the same ambience as a cyclist cycling with no bike lights on.
Well, David, I think you may have just opened a can of worms there, because we have actually had quite a few questions about car headlights and is there anything we can do? And I'm wonder if you guys know anything about what's going on in that space. We obviously are seeing them a lot more dazzling than what they used to be, and there are a lot of people having issues, and some places in the world are even blaming car headlights for increased accident rates. So are you guys able to shed any light on that? Excuse the pun.
Only anecdotal evidence is the lights are very bright, and they've got very sharp cutoff, and there's more light, I must be able to see better. The driver might feel comfortable, but in fact, if there's someone not in line with the headlights, they won't be seen, and they potentially will get run over. So I would be all for reducing the output of the headlights, having better lit streets, so you can drive as they were in the UK with, I won't say your parking lights, but relatively low light levels. Too much contrast.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think we're all noticing it more and more. I'm driving around. Also with bike lights are also, you get like little sources like this, which are highly intense and highly narrow, and that can also cause distraction. But I know the bike lights is talked about in councils and things. I'm not aware of anything yet in terms of regulation or standards, or with the international, with car lights as well. But it's a really interesting point, and I'm going to go do some research on that at some point.
I know there's a lot of conjecture about the way that the photometric measurements that they use, which is the same that they use in the lighting industry, actually probably distort the results a little bit. So whilst the headlights are complying to the standards, the actual testing of the light source in the first place is probably giving us a bit of misleading information in terms of its brightness. So I know there is a lot of research going into that area at the moment. Gentlemen, I'm going to give you a rest because we've got a quick one here that I can answer, which is how do ADSA and the International Dark Sky Association differ from Anonymous, or do they work together? Well, the answer is yes. And having been involved in ADSA since the outset, it really was about a tyranny of distance and essentially needing something a little bit more local in the Australasian region was the whole reason we were formed. But yes, of course, we work closely with the IDA. And the things like their dark sky program is amazing. And one of our board members, Kelly, is heavily involved in their board, and she's joining us tonight. Welcome, Kelly. But what I also will say too is, being involved from the start, I think it actually has been really positive that we did take this step with ADSA, because there are a lot of idiosyncrasies in the Australasian market that don't necessarily suit what happens in the US market. And so it's been good that we've been able to, I guess, differentiate those subtle differences and have our own responses to those problems. So thank you, Anonymous.
Yeah, we often don't get opportunities like this either to talk to the general public about what you can do, because we're wrapped in with the design circles and things. And so reaching out to general public is really important. And that's what ADSA does really well.
Now, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this or whether you guys are going to be able to do this, but because there is a question here from Andrew Morgan. It's about the National Light Pollution Guidelines for Wildlife. And can you tell us a little bit about it, what it affects subdivisions and other developments? And I'm not sure you guys are going to be necessarily across this, but I would like to know what your thoughts are on it from a lighting designer's point of view.
Is Kelly available?
I'm just about to have a look.
I've read through them. I mean, essentially, we understand more and more that lighting affects biodiversity. So aquatic life, marine life, land-based animals and flying animals, all these kind of things. And it's interesting because, actually, I hand it over to Kelly. She is here.
She turned the microphone on.
Kelly, are you able to talk?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Well, you can.
Absolutely.
Welcome, Kelly.
Oh, hello. Okay. All right. So the question is, what was the question again?
National Wildlife.
Tell us a little bit about it, and I guess the question specifically, would it affect subdivisions and other developments?
Okay, so the guidelines, you can find them online. They're essentially a very basic step-by-step guidance to how to deal with light pollution, how to assess it from a biological point of view, how to apply good lighting principles, and then it's got specific guidance in appendices on how best to manage lighting for different species groups. So for marine turtles, for seabirds, migratory shorebirds, and I believe bats are on the way. How does it apply to developments? I'm doing a bit of work in Queensland now with some buildings, resort developments and apartment developments on the coastline in Sunshine Coast, where they've got some specific guidelines, council guidelines around managing lights for sea turtles. And these are also now flowing over into these national light pollution guidelines. So what we're having to do is show how a building is managing the entire footprint of light within the building to keep it within the footprint of the building and to not allow it to shine out onto the nearby beaches. And so that's showing compliance with those guidelines. So those guidelines are being rolled out beyond oil and gas and beyond all the big mining companies that have traditionally had to deal with this issue, and now starting to get into the councils and on the ground across Australia. So it's make yourself familiar with those guidelines and start designing to them.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Another step.
Yes.
Very good step.
Thanks, Kelly. And do you, I've lost it, but I was going to ask, Kelly, do you actually work with lighting designers on these projects?
I do. So this is what's been really cool. In those guidelines, there was a requirement that when a design is done, you need to have a qualified professional do that design. But what you also have to do is you need to get a qualified biologist, be it an ornithologist or a bird person or a turtle person, to work with on that design and to advise on that design. And so I'm working on a job now in the Sunshine Coast where I've worked really closely with the lighting designer for the last few weeks to help refine his design and to provide just some specific advice on, what's good for turtles, what's not. And it's really nice. It's a beautiful design that we've sort of come up with. So so if you get a good designer that's friendly, then it works really well.
Very good. And Chris Ryan here has also just mentioned in the chat, what about biodiversity? Don't forget the plants and fungi. Is that's possible in a future revision?
So with the National Light Pollution Guidelines, they were produced by the Migratory Species Unit of the Commonwealth Government, and their remit is for listed and migratory species. So they can only really address species that are recognised on international treaties or migratory. So turtles, birds, whales, things like that. So getting into taxa that's not on those sort of lists isn't under their remit, but it's something that I think, you know, everyone should think about regardless. You know, if you're going to be managing light for good conservation of the dark sky or conservation or protecting human health, then every wildlife, every insect, every bird, every species should have a place at that table and be considered as part of that management design.
That's great, Kelly. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our time. However, I've still got a few questions here we'd like to get through. So what I might do is just do the quick wrap up here. And but if anyone wants to stay on, I'll actually, we might stay on a bit longer if you gentlemen have the time. David?
Yep, sure. Can we mention one thing?
Yes.
The Cry Awards.
Please.
A program that we've started today, actually, which essentially gets the public to nominate what they think are awful lighting projects within their city. And essentially we held an award ceremony for this, and we have a whole program which aims to rectify one installation in Melbourne, but we're asking for entries from everywhere so we can see everyone's bad lighting. But the goal of this whole program is to basically to get all bad submissions, to look at them. Then we have a whole program of designing them, and we have support from manufacturers that are Australian, and they will work with the designer and installer and try to rectify the situation. So there's plenty of information at thecriawards.com.
It's, if I can just pipe in there a bit, it's very much Jackson's baby, and there've been so many excellence awards program picking out good lighting design. This is very much aimed at stuff that's not really good, but can be fixed relatively easily. And to encourage that small grade to go from really awful to quite good.
And reducing light pollution is probably the main
key,
goal of it.
yes, and glare.
Excellent. It's always good to hear. Well, I just, as I say, I'll quickly sign off, but we will keep this going so we can answer some of these extra questions. But again, I just wanted to get back to our sponsors, Buckford, and to say big thank you to those guys. Again, we can't put these events on without the likes of our sponsors. And so to the Buckford Illumination Group, thank you very much again for tonight. And we also remind everyone that's out there, thank you very much for attending. We have another webinar coming up, I think, in July 14th. And again, some fantastic speakers. We have Fred Watson, Sriram Murali and Dylan O'Donnell. And that one's on dark sky experiences, essentially what switches people on to dark sky lighting. And as always, we, as a volunteer organisation, we always encourage you to join, become members of ADSA, which you can do via our website. So thank you all to those, and appreciate those that we've run over time. Thank you. And for those that will want to stay on, well, then we're going to continue on for a little bit. Now, I did have a question here that I wanted to jump onto.
Sorry, I was laughing at Chris's comment. Can we submit a whole city as awful lighting?
Where was Chris from? So what is the lighting industry's position on the emerging health impacts on humans from exposure to light at night?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, because only about 20 years ago did we understand how start to really understand how our bodies respond to light and how it affects us. And that was through finding an extra receptor in your eye that is triggered by intensity, but also high frequency light, so blue light. And from that, there's research, it's just increasing, but like every week, to be honest. But what we're understanding is that any disruption to your natural circadian rhythm causes issues. So basically, if your body's not sleeping when it's meant to sleeping, then that only causes damage to your body. So your body needs to sleep and repair, and melatonin is your natural
sleeping tablet.
Exactly.
The idea of tunable white lighting, which starts at maybe 2700K, which is nice, warm, incandescent color, goes up to 6000K, which is daylight, and then back down again at night, is being put forward as a solution to office lighting particularly. My preference, yes, you can probably do that. It's expensive to do it, and I haven't had the fortune to work on a project where it's been adopted, but I think people should take a step back, and if you want to get suppressed melatonin during the day, go outside, look out a window, and don't rely on electric lighting to fulfill those needs. And certainly at night, as the lights get dimmer, they should be much lower color temperature. And I know a number of people who are adversely affected significantly by the 460 nanometer blue light wear colored glasses to filter out that light. It must make working around the house at night odd, but that's what they do. It's research is increasing, and I'm sure in the relatively near future there will be products that work cost effectively that can address those issues.
And all these issues have only, I mean, there's a lot of issues with sleep deprivation in children that we're seeing becoming more prevalent over the last 10, 15 years. And I think definitely this is related to devices and lighting within our environment and the increasing amount of it, essentially.
And certainly I'm led to believe, anecdotally, that the older you get, the lower the color temperature you prefer.
Yeah.
We will take that from someone that clearly knows.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting topic. There's research everywhere online. I just say go to reputable sources. So go to your scientific journals and things, and they actually have good studies that have been conducted. But holistically, yeah, we've been living with day and night cycles for a very long time. So our bodies are used to that. So if we make any adjustment to that and expose ourselves to light at night, it affects us in a negative way because it's not allowing our bodies to repair. So it's not healthy.
In fact, the last webinar we had before you, gentlemen, was Dr. Eva Schornhammer, I think her name was. A fantastic talk. That's on our website. Absolutely brilliant. Schornhammer, thank you, Marnie. But yeah, fantastic, her research. An interesting one that I always get asked about when we're talking about, because we do include circadian disruption in the story about light pollution and why we should reduce it. But often the response is that people will do far more harm to themselves in their own homes than what they will ever do outside under a street light. Can you guys elaborate on that stance?
I would tend to think that's probably true. In the standard of lighting generally in housing is based on cost and based on more is better. My house has got 100 downlights in it. That's awesome. Mine's better. It's got 150. And certainly with the trend now into LED lighting, high color temperature light fittings give you more light, therefore I'll use them. And I was speaking with a supplier recently who said I think it was Sydney, in the apartment development, the only light fittings that people would install was 6,000K. But that's what the market wanted.
Yeah.
And that's far worse than any street light.
It's an interesting one, and there's not a lot of research done into it, but I think culture has a lot to do with it as well. Because having worked overseas a little bit in projects, I find that clients demand different color temperatures because that's what they want or that's what they're used to culturally. So, yeah, it's kind of a difficult one to say conclusively this is what should be.
I was dealing with an electrical contractor in outer suburban Melbourne who had the pleasure of telling me that you couldn't get 2700K downloads, because he's only ever heard of 3K and 4K. Clearly, I demonstrated he was in error. And the little supply shop out there has never been asked for 2700K till I walked in.
Mm. And interesting things like culturally, I've talked to different people and saying that post-World War II, having a job was a good thing, and jobs were associated with places that were bright, and they were like factories and warehouses, and these were lit in cool color temperatures. So a lot of people started to use that in their home lighting when they could actually do that. And this has just sort of continued on as a trend, is like when something's bright and white, then that's like productivity and a good thing. However, you know, when you're at home, you know, that's often time where you don't need to have the same functionality as being in a warehouse or something.
I've also noticed working in Southeast Asia, the further away from the equator, the warmer the color temperature. But once you get to somewhere like Singapore or Bangkok, they much prefer cool white lighting. It makes them feel cool. Whereas we in Melbourne, and heaven forbid those poor people in Hobart, need a much lower color temperature, like to try and feel warm.
I can second that tonight, I can tell you. Incidentally, Chris Ryan, the city in question that they wanted to submit us a whole was the Sunshine Coast. I don't think anyone's surprised by that answer. Thank you again, Chris. I'm going to answer a very quick one here. Ed Parker, why don't road authorities use semi-cut-off street lighting lamps? No need to light above the horizontal. Exactly as was said before by, I think, Jackson, it is about cost. The street lights that they put in, it's essentially one size fits all approach. And so that street light basically has to do anything from a 12-lane wide highway to a 1-lane wide road. And by reducing the number of fitting options that they have, they reduce their costs. So essentially that one fitting spills light and spews light everywhere because they never know where it's going to go and what pole they're going to put it on. And so, these guys negotiate those contracts by the millions, and it's a million of one type of light that does all. Now, this will be our final question, and it's from Stephen Holland. And the question is, gentlemen, is there a booklet or something anywhere you can download and give to your neighbour, Lighting for Dummies?
Oh God, there is in the works actually. It's something we're halfway through doing for a council in terms of outlining the Australian standards in a very basic way.
In plain English.
Yeah, because I mean, honestly, David and I read it together sometimes and have to have a discussion for 10 minutes to figure out what they actually mean. So yeah, condensing all that into a document that's simple with diagrams is a difficult thing to do. However, we have started to do it. But there is definitely stuff on the ADSA guidelines.
Yes, thanks, Marnie. The best practice lighting guidelines specific for reducing light pollution. Appreciate that. Look, I think, David's been doing this longer than me. I've been doing this for over 20 years. And the one thing that amazes me about lighting is that I still learn something new every day. And David, I'm sure you'll probably feel the same. And that, I think, in its very nature, probably gives you an inclination of how difficult it is to summarise that into a dot point or a diagram or anything in that regard. It's a very, difficult. And that's where great education is a wonderful thing. And
a little knowledge is dangerous.
Yes.
But yeah, definitely look at your local city council or authority, because people have posted here, and that's what we mentioned, the Melbourne one, Brisbane City has one, New South Wales has one. They all have guidelines with regards to, and they're good in terms of what they're trying to achieve.
Even if they may contradict themselves a little occasionally.
Yeah.
Look, I think it's a little bit like the snowball rolling down the hill, and we've probably, got a snowball that'll fit in a teacup at the moment. Brisbane City Council, Ed's mentioned, has some guidelines re light pollution. Their kids and neighbourhood issues are not interested in doing anything re their street lights. I know Hobart City Council have in their city strategy now introduce comments around light pollution and addressing it, but there's actually no substance behind the strategy. So we are starting to see councils take it on, and I think the supply chains with Buckford tonight participating, you guys as the actual lighting designers doing the work, us as laymen and people out there. I think that's really what it is. It's every light does make a difference. Light pollution is a little bit like Chinese strip torture. Little by little, it all adds up. But at the same time, little by little, we can all do something to make a difference. So
that's just turning it off.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts, gentlemen, before we sign off?
I guess two things. If you're involved in the designing process, mock things up. Easy, it's simple. You can sort out issues with how you're going to make it, how you're going to install it. People can see what it looks like. I can pick up a light for you and tell you, this is a really super good pen. It'll do all these fabulous things. But when you try and write with it, it doesn't actually do what I wanted. So mocking things up, presenting it to the community consultation process so everyone can see what it is they look like they're going to be buying. Mock-ups.
I just say thank you to everyone that's attended, because when you attend, it allows us to convey knowledge, and basically then you can talk about it to other people, which is the whole idea. The more you talk about it, the more people are aware of what lighting is and how it affects us, how it affects the world around us. And that's what we need to be doing.
Wonderful. Guys, again, I can't thank you enough. Buckford, again, can't thank you enough. Really valuable. The feedback has come through, and I will share this with you, has been amazing. So lots of thanks and lots of people saying it's been incredibly helpful. So really do appreciate it. And one of our highest attended webinars ever. So really good stuff, guys. Thank you very much. And to everyone that attended, thank you. And I believe we've got an audience out there of like-minded people. So please, all of you, keep up the good fight.
Excellent. Pleasure.
Have a good one. Thanks,
Ciao.
Thanks,
Evening all.
Cheers.